I've spent my entire life in that small town where everyone knows everyone else's business and nothing ever really changes. We're surrounded by dense woods and empty fields, the kind of place where folks stick to their routines and leave the unusual well enough alone. You could walk down Main Street, past the few shops and the diner, and wave to at least half the town on a regular day. Gossip spreads fast, and mysteries are rare here, which is why the hospital on the edge of town became a sort of legend. The hospital had closed years ago, long before I was old enough to remember it. People said it was because of funding issues. Others whispered about a tragedy that was covered up. Whatever the reason, the building was abandoned, and it became this looming presence, sitting just beyond the last few houses, fenced off and forgotten. A place you could see from the road but didn't think too hard about, unless you heard one of the stories. In recent weeks, though, whispers started up again. People said they'd seen lights flickering in the windows at odd hours, shadows moving across the empty floors. Old-timers waved it off as nonsense, but kids and teenagers started daring each other to go look. I didn't think much of it at first, just ghost stories to scare the younger kids. But as more people started talking, the curiosity grew. One night, Tom, Will, and I decided we'd see the hospital for ourselves. The three of us had been friends since we could walk, and we were used to each other's schemes. Tom was always the first to jump at anything thrilling. Will usually played along, and I mostly just tried to keep them from getting in too deep. But that night, curiosity got the best of all of us. It was late, the town quiet as we set off toward the edge where the hospital stood. We kept our voices low, feeling the chill of the night air settle around us as we left the streetlights behind. The hospital loomed dark and empty as we approached. In the moonlight, it looked almost alive, as if it had been waiting for someone to come back. We hung back at first, moving around the building's perimeter, checking for any sign of life or movement. Nothing stirred, and the windows remained dark. Tom joked about the stories, trying to lighten the mood, but there was a weight in the air, a silence that seemed to seep from the building itself. After a few minutes of peering into the shadows, we convinced ourselves there was nothing to worry about and decided to go inside. The front doors creaked open with a push, letting us slip into the dim, hollow space beyond. The smell hit us immediately, stale, like a mix of dust and old, forgotten things. Our footsteps echoed down the hallway as we took in the rows of empty rooms, the old reception desk covered in layers of grime, and the cracked linoleum floor that stretched out before us. We wandered, our flashlights casting brief glimpses of peeling walls and rusted metal fixtures. The place felt frozen in time, untouched since the last patient was discharged and the staff packed up. It was as though someone had just closed the doors one day and never returned. The silence was heavy, every sound we made amplified in the stillness. Minutes passed, and we found nothing but decay. Tom muttered something about it being a bust, and I started to feel a mix of disappointment and relief. There was nothing here, just the memories of a place left to rot. But as we turned to head back, a flicker of movement caught my eye. I paused, but when I looked again, there was only darkness. I shook it off, telling myself it was a trick of the light. We continued deeper into the hospital, curiosity overcoming common sense. The corridors grew narrower, darker, and colder as we moved further in. Our flashlights barely cut through the gloom, and the silence settled in even thicker. Occasionally, I felt a prickling on the back of my neck, an awareness that we weren't entirely alone in this empty place. There was an old patient ward up ahead, marked by a faded sign on the wall. We moved slowly, inspecting rooms left and right, each as empty as the last. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, a sensation that something or someone was observing us from just beyond our line of sight. And then we came to the end of a corridor. A figure stood there, partially obscured by shadows, motionless. The light from my flashlight barely reached him, casting only a faint outline, but I could tell he was looking in our direction. For a moment, I thought it was just another trick of the mind, a shadow, a leftover mannequin maybe. But then he shifted, ever so slightly, and it was clear he was watching us. Instinctively, I glanced back, signaling to Will and Tom that we needed to leave. But before we could turn around, another figure appeared at the other end of the corridor, blocking our way back. In that moment, everything inside me froze. The figure at the end of the corridor wasn't just some shadow. He was real, standing still, his gaze fixed on us. Behind us, the second figure blocked the only way out, creating an inescapable trap. They didn't move or make a sound, just stood there, watching. Panic took over as my mind scrambled for an explanation, but nothing made sense. We were alone in an abandoned hospital in the dead of night, and there was no logical reason for anyone else to be here, let alone two people on opposite sides of the corridor, silently waiting. The three of us stood motionless, staring at each other, trying to understand what was happening. Tom whispered something, his voice barely audible, but I couldn't take my eyes off the figure in front of us. Every second stretched out painfully, the silence amplifying our fear. With each passing moment, the figures felt more menacing, their silent presence exuding an unspoken threat. We had no options. Moving toward either figure seemed like walking into a trap. My mind raced, desperate to find an escape, even though every exit felt cut off. In the corner of my vision, I noticed an open door leading to a small room. Without a second thought, I motioned to the others, and we backed up slowly, never taking our eyes off the figures. Once inside, we slammed the door shut and shoved anything we could find against it. A metal cabinet, a chair, anything that might hold them back. The room was cramped and smelled of mildew, but we barely noticed, our fear consuming every other sense. In the silence of the room, I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and fast, each beat echoing in the small space. Outside, we could faintly make out the sound of footsteps approaching, a slow and deliberate pace that sent waves of dread through me. They were coming closer, and with each step, the reality of our situation grew sharper. The door was thin, the kind meant to separate patient rooms, and our makeshift barricade wouldn't hold long against any real force. We needed a way out, fast. My eyes darted around the room, looking for something, anything that could get us out. That's when I noticed the small, grimy window on the far wall. It was narrow and covered in years of dirt, but it was the only way left. Tom saw it too, and we quickly agreed it was our best chance. Tom grabbed a metal stool and began striking the window, each hit sending vibrations through the room. The glass didn't break easily, and for a moment I feared we'd be trapped here as the footsteps grew louder just outside the door. Will joined in, taking turns as they slammed the stool against the window, the sound of shattering glass slowly cutting through the dense silence. As they worked, I watched the door, every creak making my heart skip. The footsteps had stopped, replaced by an unbearable silence. Then, as the last shard of glass broke free, I heard the doorknob rattle, followed by a faint scratching sound, like nails dragging down the wood. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in as panic surged through me. I climbed up to the broken window, carefully removing loose shards, and climbed through, feeling the jagged edges scraping against my arms and legs. One by one, we climbed out, barely fitting through the small opening. The cold night air hit me like a wave, grounding me for a brief moment as I felt the safety of the outside. But I didn't stop to take it in. I stumbled to my feet, helping the others out, and we ran without looking back, our hearts pounding as we put distance between us and the hospital. Outside, we kept running until the hospital was just a distant silhouette in the night. Only then did we stop, out of breath and shaken, glancing back at the looming building. The lights in the windows had gone dark again, the place silent as if nothing had happened. The night was still, and the sense of dread we'd felt inside was beginning to fade. Growing up in a small town on the edge of an even smaller village, life seemed as predictable as the changing seasons. My father, a farmer by trade, kept a steady rhythm that shaped our days. The mornings were early, the afternoons spent in the fields, and the evenings in our small house, where silence filled in the spaces between our conversations. But every few weeks, we'd make the journey to the neighboring village, a place that felt like an extension of our own, yet held a distinct air of mystery. Our main reason for these visits was the handmade tools store. The store itself was small, almost tucked away, with weathered wooden shelves and an earthy smell that clung to the air like a memory. My father would always go to inspect the tools, discussing with the store owner which blades were sharp enough, which handles sturdy enough. I was young then, quiet and curious, always lingering behind, observing from a distance. And that's where I first saw her, the store owner's daughter. She had a quiet presence, slipping between customers with an almost ghostly grace. She'd sometimes offer my father help or smile at me from behind a row of garden tools. Even as a boy, I felt a strange attraction to her, though I never knew why. Maybe it was the way she seemed to blend into the background, like she belonged to that place more than anyone else. Years passed, my visits to the village becoming less frequent, yet I never forgot her. The store, the village, and the girl had etched themselves into my memory. As I grew older, that childish curiosity morphed into something more defined, more urgent. I couldn't shake her from my thoughts, her quiet mannerisms and subtle presence haunting my memories. On rare occasions, I'd catch a glimpse of her in the village, perhaps a few years older, her movements a bit more composed, her face carrying traces of the same familiarity and mystery that had drawn me to her as a child. It felt strange to be drawn to someone I'd never really spoken to, but something about her felt magnetic, as if the quiet life of the village had molded her into something uniquely beautiful, something I couldn't find in the world outside. And so, one day, I mustered the courage to ask her out. I'd practiced it 1,000 times in my head, the words never sounding right. When I finally approached her, they stumbled out with more awkwardness than I'd hoped. To my surprise, she accepted. We arranged to meet at a small cafe on the edge of town. That evening, as dusk settled and the town began to quiet, I felt a rare excitement, a thrill that pushed me out of the routine I'd grown so accustomed to. This was more than a simple outing. It was a break from the life I'd always known, a chance to connect with someone who felt like a fragment of my past, yet remained tantalizingly out of reach. When I arrived at the cafe, she was already there, seated near the window, the fading sunlight casting shadows that danced across her face. It was a small place, barely filled, the kind where you could sit for hours without anyone noticing. She looked up as I approached, offering a faint smile that felt both familiar and distant. We ordered coffee, and as we talked, I began to feel at ease. Our conversation was gentle, unhurried, and I noticed things about her I'd never seen before. How her hands moved when she spoke, the way she tilted her head slightly when she listened. The sky outside began to darken, the village settling into its usual stillness. There was something about being there, in that quiet moment with her, that felt as if the world had paused. But just as I began to feel a sense of contentment, of something falling into place, I noticed a shift in the atmosphere. The quiet murmur of the cafe was interrupted by the sudden sound of the door slamming open. I glanced up, and 2 men entered, their faces obscured, their movements tense. Instinctively, I felt a chill settle over me, a sense that something was terribly wrong. They moved through the cafe quickly, their eyes scanning the room as they gestured aggressively toward the cashier. The other patrons grew still, glancing down or away, as if trying to make themselves invisible. My pulse quickened, and I felt an overwhelming urge to get out, to escape, before we became a part of whatever was happening. I turned to her, and in a low whisper, barely audible over the pounding of my heart, suggested we leave. She nodded, her face pale, her expression mirroring my own fear. Carefully, I took her hand, and we slid out of our seats, moving as quietly as we could toward the back of the cafe. The men were occupied, their attention fixated on the cash drawer. We moved quickly, slipping out through a narrow side door and into the alley behind. Outside, the air was cold, the quietness of the night amplifying our footsteps as we ran. But when I looked back, I saw that one of the guys was following us. I could feel her grip tighten in mine, and we headed toward an old stone house nearby, a place I knew well enough to know the door was thick, nearly impenetrable. As we reached it, I pulled her inside, shutting the door firmly behind us. For a brief moment, it felt like we were safe, hidden away from the chaos we'd just escaped. But then came the sound of pounding on the door, rough and desperate. The men had followed us. My heart pounded as I braced myself against the door, praying it would hold. Inside the old stone house, the air was dense with silence, broken only by our uneven breathing. I could feel her presence beside me, though neither of us dared to look at the other. Every muscle in my body felt coiled, ready to react to any sign of intrusion. The banging on the door grew louder, the men's voices muffled but filled with frustration. I could picture them just outside, fists hammering against the wood, pushing and straining against the door. My only hope was that it would hold. The house was dark, only thin slivers of moonlight creeping through cracks in the walls. The noise eventually lessened, turning into frustrated murmurs and the sound of footsteps retreating. But I didn't move. My mind was too tangled with fear, each second stretching as I waited, unsure if they'd truly left. Time passed, though I couldn't say how long. The house seemed to absorb every sound, trapping us in a silence that felt heavier with each passing minute. Beside me, she remained quiet, her stillness matching my own. I wondered if she felt the same dread, the same nagging thought that perhaps this wasn't over. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and yet we stayed there, too afraid to breathe too loudly, too afraid to draw any attention to ourselves. I kept my focus on the door, half expecting it to burst open at any second. After what felt like an eternity, I noticed a shift in the air. The silence outside seemed different, less charged with tension. Cautiously, I approached the door, peeking through a narrow crack in the wood. The street was empty, the robbers nowhere in sight. Slowly, I turned to her, nodding that it was safe to leave. We slipped out, keeping close to the shadows as we made our way back toward the edge of the village. The streets were empty, the night pressing down on us with a weight that seemed to mirror the terror we'd just escaped. I felt each step acutely, the sounds of the night around us seeming foreign, warped by the events of the evening. As we neared the outskirts of town, I could feel the weight of exhaustion settling in. Yet, as we finally approached our separate paths, we didn't say a word. The next morning, I awoke with a strange numbness, the events of the previous night hovering at the edge of my mind like a bad dream. But reality settled in quickly, piercing through my thoughts with a cold clarity. My father had decided, without explanation, that we were moving away. It was as abrupt as the events of the night before, and I could do nothing but accept it. And after that horrible day, I never saw her again. I'd lived in this village my whole life, a small, unassuming place surrounded by fields and the distant shadows of forested hills. It wasn't the kind of town that drew much attention, just a scattering of homes, narrow streets, and a single general store that served as the community's hub. In a way, I liked the predictability of it all, the slow, familiar rhythms of village life. Most days were quiet, and most people were friends, or at least friendly enough to make you feel like you belonged. One of my closest friends in the village was Mark. He was a few years older than me, and we'd known each other since childhood. We'd been through a lot together, laughs over shared meals, walks down winding trails, and the easy conversations that only old friends can have. We'd meet often, usually at his place, where his wife, Mrs. Dacey, would sometimes join us for dinner. She was a kind, gentle woman who always seemed to bring a warmth to their home. I'd grown used to the comfort of that friendship, to the sense of connection that was so rare in a village as quiet as ours. But lately, something had shifted. Mike had been distant, almost withdrawn, his cheerful demeanor fading. I'd notice it in the small things, a lack of eye contact, a tired, distracted look, and a silence that hung between us like a weight. At first I brushed it off, thinking he was just going through something personal. But as the days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The first time I truly noticed something was off was at one of our dinners. I'd gone over to his place like usual, expecting the familiar comfort of Mrs. Dacey's cooking and the warmth of their home. But that night, Mrs. Daisy was nowhere to be found. Her absence was glaring, the quiet around the house even more so. I asked Mike about her, hoping for a simple explanation, maybe that she was out running an errand or visiting family, but he only shrugged, barely looking up from his plate, offering no explanation. The silence lingered as we ate, an unnatural stillness that made the food taste bland and the air feel heavy. Mike barely spoke, barely looked at me. It was as if he was somewhere else, lost in his own thoughts, a million miles away. I tried to make small talk, to pull him back into the moment, but each attempt fell flat. He'd only nod or mutter a vague response, and eventually I gave up. In the days that followed, Mike continued to withdraw, pulling away from me and the rest of the village. He stopped showing up to the store, stopped greeting people on the street, and seemed to disappear into his own shadow. I couldn't help but wonder about Mrs. Dacey. Her absence felt strange, almost unnatural, as if something had shifted in their home, leaving only a hollow shell of the life they once shared. I started noticing the way the other villagers looked at Mike's house, their glances lingering a little too long, their expressions tight and wary. It seemed I wasn't the only one who'd sensed the change. Whispers began to circulate, low murmurs that hinted at something darker, a quiet unease that settled over our small community. I wanted to believe there was a reasonable explanation. Mike was my friend, a man I'd trusted for years. But each time I approached his house, hoping to catch a glimpse of him or maybe even see Mrs. Daisy returning, the place stood silent, the windows dark and unwelcoming. When I did see him on rare occasions, his demeanor was the same, detached, almost cold, as if he'd become a stranger overnight. I felt a growing sense of dread, an uncertainty that gnawed at me with every unanswered question. It was as if a shadow had fallen over our friendship, clouding my memories and casting doubt on everything I thought I knew about him. I couldn't help but wonder if he was hiding something, if there was a reason for his silence that he couldn't or wouldn't share. The morning the police arrived, I knew something had gone terribly wrong. Their cars pulled up outside Mike's house, their flashing lights breaking the usual calm of the village. A few neighbors had gathered, watching from a distance, their expressions a mix of curiosity and concern. I joined them, a tight feeling in my chest as I tried to understand what was happening. I approached one of the officers, hoping for answers. They were polite, but guarded, giving away little. They told me they were investigating a disappearance, their eyes flicking toward Mike's house with a seriousness that only deepened my worry. When I pressed further, asking if Mrs. Dacey was the one who was missing, the officer's gaze grew even more distant. Yes, he confirmed she was, and Mike was their primary suspect. The words hit me like a blow, a heaviness settling in my chest as I processed what they'd said. Mike? A suspect? The idea felt impossible, wrong on so many levels. Mike was a good man, a friend I'd known for most of my life. I struggled to reconcile the image of the man I knew with the person the police were looking for. But as the officer continued, explaining that Mike was nowhere to be found, a cold sense of dread washed over me. He was gone. Just vanished, without a word, without a trace. It was as if he'd taken his silence and left, leaving behind only questions and the hollow shell of a friendship that had once been so strong. The whispers around me grew louder, the villagers exchanging glances and murmuring in hushed tones. I could feel their suspicion, their fear, and for the first time, I felt truly alone. I was left with a choice, to cling to the memories of the friend I thought I knew, or to face the unsettling possibility that he might not have been the man I believed him to be. The days after the police visit passed in a blur. The village was no longer the place of calm I'd once known. Rumors circulated quickly, and it seemed as if everyone had a theory. The whispers grew louder with each passing day, questions piling up without answers. And amid it all, the memory of my last encounters with Mike weighed heavily on me, the silence between us now taking on a sinister quality. As I replayed our last dinner, his hollow expression and distant gaze haunted me. Mrs. Dacey's absence now felt deliberate, a glaring void that seemed to loom over every thought. I couldn't believe it at first, that Mike could have harmed her, that he could be involved in something so dark. But the more I tried to rationalize it, the less sense it made. There had been signs, I realized, subtle hints I'd ignored or brushed off. The police came to my door one morning, asking questions about Mike and Mrs. Dacey, and pressing for any details I could provide. Their inquiries felt accusatory, their questions leaving me defensive and on edge. What could I tell them? I'd seen Mike withdraw, but I'd never thought it would come to this. As I struggled to answer, I began to question everything, to doubt my own memories, as if they held clues I'd missed. I began to fear that I'd been complicit in some way, that I'd ignored warning signs that had been right in front of me. The man I thought I knew felt like a stranger, and the realization cut deeper than I could have imagined. I knew the police suspected him, and as much as I wanted to defend him, doubt gnawed at me. I began to feel isolated, unable to discuss these thoughts with anyone else in the village. People were already talking, and I could sense their eyes on me, as if my closeness with Mike had somehow made me complicit. Eventually, I came to a decision. The police investigation had intensified, and it was clear that they weren't giving up on finding Mike. I knew that whatever had happened was beyond my understanding, that the answers I sought might never come. One day, I packed my things and left the village. It wasn't an easy choice, but it felt necessary.